All right, I'm just going to let a few more people trickle in. For those of you who have just joined, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. We'll get started in one moment. All right, I think ostensibly more people will continue to roll in, but we should get started given that a lot of you have joined. So again, welcome to our June monthly webinar. We're really excited about our speakers today and the content we have to cover. So what we'll go over today, we'll introduce the people who will be speaking, and then I will give an update / overview of H1 Connect. For those of you who are aware of what H1 Connect is, don't worry, I'll be brief. And then we will turn to our interview with Dr. Sean Kivlehan, which will be monitored by Dr. Rebecca Weintraub. So thanks to both of them for joining. To get us started, most of you know both Miles and myself. I'm Katie McHenry, and I lead the Doctor Network over here at H1 Connect. Miles is our chief of staff and really leading the charge on the H1 Connect effort. Rebecca and Sean, for those who aren't aware of who you are, I'll let you briefly introduce yourselves. You'll spend a lot of time talking through your background later, but feel free. Rebecca, if you want to go first, just because you're the next picture.
Sure. Wonderful to see everyone. Rebecca Weintraub. I'm the medical lead for H1 Connect and a faculty member at Harvard Medical School and practice medicine, actually at the same hospital that Sean does. Sean, I'll pass the baton over to you.
Thanks. Sean Kivlehan. I'm an emergency medicine physician based in Boston, also faculty at Harvard Medical School and with Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. I'm looking forward to talking with everybody today.
All right, thank you both. So I'm going to pop over to the next slide. Again, I know a lot of the people on this call are familiar with what H1 Connect is, but for those who aren't, I want to provide some background. So H1's mission is to connect the world to the right doctors. So there are two sides of the business that work together in order to do this. The one on the right is what we refer to as H1 Connect. And this is the one that this group is probably more familiar with, wherein we connect medical professionals in our network, like yourselves, to training, resources, and volunteer opportunities with NGOs we work with, like Team Rubicon. I think there are some people joining from there, Save the Children, Fajer, other groups like that. Now, the left side of this is the part of our business that funds our ability to do this work. And that is connecting doctors with pharma and life science companies for research and clinical trial work. So this involves our maintaining a database of doctors that pull from public registries, hospital websites, sources like that, which is amounted to 10 million plus doctor profiles. So the H1 Connect network you're part of has at this juncture around like 45, 48, I believe, when I checked this morning, medical professionals, and it's growing quickly. So now that we've established who H1 is and how it works, I'll provide some more context on how H1 Connect started, what we're doing today, and our vision for the future. So our mission with H1 Connect specifically is to build global health equity. If you look at the bottom right of this slide, back in October when the conflict broke out in the Middle East, we said, hey, we have this extensive database of healthcare professionals. Let's just reach out and see who wants to help, first in Israel and then in Gaza subsequently. So since then, we've expanded and built direct relationships with NGOs like, again, Save the Children, Team Rubicon, Fajer, et cetera, who support humanitarian response efforts, not only in areas of conflict like Gaza and Ukraine, but also in disaster response following something like the earthquake in Haiti a few years ago, and in generally supporting under-resourced health systems across the globe with like disease control and capacity building initiatives. ultimately, what we see H1 Connect being able to do is to start connecting healthcare professionals like yourselves in our doctor network, who may want to engage with pharma and industry and the opportunities they present to work on research and clinical trials, in furtherance of this mission to make sure everyone has access to the same quality of care across the globe. I'll move over to the next slide. So at this stage, we're still primarily focused on that first humanitarian response pillar. And what we've learned from working with NGOs is that following that earthquake in Haiti I mentioned previously, a lot of healthcare professionals just like showed up, eager to help, which is amazing. But the lack of structure and coordination proved to be a challenge. So the World Health Organization established the Emergency Medical Team or EMT program. As part of that program, the WHO pushes NGOs like the ones we work with to maintain large reserve rosters of healthcare professionals, again, like yourselves, who are vetted, engaged, trained, and ready to go before one of these conflicts or disasters breaks out. But maintaining these rosters is a huge lift for the NGOs we work with. Again, I've mentioned Save the Children, Global Response Medicine, Project Hope, other groups we work with. Our goal with H1 Connect at this stage is to alleviate that lift and build a global reserve rosters that NGOs can pull from based on the specific needs they have. What this also does is provide you, so the people, the healthcare professionals in our network interested in humanitarian aid, with more resources and more opportunities with these same NGOs. So I'll wrap up. I told you I'd keep it brief. With an overview of what being part of H1 Connect network means today and in the future. So by joining H1 Connect today, by being a part of it, for those of you who already have joined, and completing your profile, you're being pre-vetted, and NGOs know that when they're considering the candidates that we sent over for these deployments. You'll have access to opportunities with the over 10 NGOs we work with via trainings and applications that we post on the H1 Connect site. And you'll be able to collaborate with your global peers. So we have a WhatsApp group that you're able to join that I can share out and follow up to this. And then ultimately, you'll be able to leverage our relationships, so H1's relationships with pharma and life science companies, to participate in global health research. So with that, I'm gonna kick it over to our lovely guest speakers. So Dr. Rebecca Weintraub and Dr. Sean Kivlehan. Before we get into the Q&A portion of this, the fireside chat, so to speak, Sean, if you could give an overview of HHI and the work you're doing there for context, since it'll come up in conversation, that would be great to start us off.
Great. Thanks so much, Katie. So I'll very briefly talk about a little bit of background of Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, what we do, and why we fit in this collaboration with H1, and then we'll get into more depth in the interview. But briefly, Harvard Humanitarian Initiative is an interfaculty initiative at Harvard, and what that means is it brings together faculty and experts from throughout the university, not just in medicine and public health, but in all the other schools, law and business and education and so on and so forth. And the idea is that you have a question, you have a challenge. And in this case, the challenge is, how do we make humanitarian response better? And you can define better. There's many different ways it can be made better. And you bring people together from all these different schools and perspectives to tackle this challenge together. And that's what HHI is. And we do that through a variety of efforts, mainly a lot of research, but also a lot of education and leadership training. Throughout HHI, there's several different programs looking at different aspects of humanitarian response. And I'll talk briefly about a program that I lead called the Emergency Health Systems Program. And that program was developed to bridge the gap between humanitarian response and global health and emergency care system strengthening. So, and this ties to my background as an emergency medicine physician and something that I'm involved with. And many of you have probably experienced this as well. When I participated in many humanitarian responses, I quickly recognized that without good, resilient, and strong emergency care system structures, future humanitarian responses are going to need external support as well. To build a good humanitarian response, we want to build a strong system beneath it that can scale to future humanitarian responses. And conversely, to build a good emergency care system, which is something I really believe in and a lot of my other work focuses on, you need to have surge capacity and the ability to respond to the inevitable challenges and pressures on the system. So there's this gap between humanitarian and development world, and we work at the Emergency Health Systems Program to bridge that gap as much as we can. And we do that through partnering with institutions locally, national level, and regional and global level. And that includes UN organizations and governments and funders, and also many of the NGOs that you're going to hear about today. One representative example of our work is what we've been doing in Ukraine for the past over 2 years. And looking at the participant list here, I see several of you who have participated strongly in this effort and in fact traveled to Ukraine several times with our team. So thank you, first of all, for your constant support of the people of Ukraine and responding to this crisis. And also thank you for joining here today. It's great to see you, at least virtually. This is just one project that we do. And to give an example of how we work, we at HHI, we partner with organizations. In this case, we partner with International Medical Corps to deliver emergency trauma care training throughout Ukraine, also chemical bio training and mass casualty management training. And you can see here, I'm not going to get into these details. This is just a representative summary slide, but over the past 2 years, we've trained now actually over 6,000 people across 13 locations in Ukraine, and you can see the map on the bottom left. But the key here is partnership and building sustainable capacity that remains after we leave. And this project, we've trained instructors, and now all the classes that we teach, that we used to have external people from our roster come and travel teach, they've trained instructors, and now everything is taught locally by Ukrainian instructors. And the project is transitioning to sustainability by partnering with numerous local universities who are going to take this forward. And you can see that list on the bottom right. So thanks, Katie. And that's just a sampling and an idea of how we think about this space.
Thanks so much, Sean. Before, Rebecca, I let you get up and running, I just want to let everyone who has joined know that we will leave time for a Q&A with you all at the end of this. So as questions come up, feel free to drop them in the chat, and then Miles and I will be monitoring and we'll flag those. If you'd like to speak, feel free to raise your hand and we can throw you on camera. But Rebecca, take it away.
Thank you, Katie. And Sean, thank you so much. That is such an incredible example of some of the North Stars, I have to say, that H1 Connect is aiming for, not only in the sense of how do you build the capacity, how do you prepare the capacity, and then how do you ensure the local capacity has the skills, education, and is able to bring that on and transfer that to the next generation. Sean, we wanted to kind of take a dial back for a second because you have a lot of fans on the line today. Many folks are joining who've been in service with you or have been following your work, and people are eager to kind of peel the onion layer back and hear a little bit more about Sean. So your background, how you came to this work, kind of the threads of, how did you figure out you wanted to be an emergency medicine physician? And then from there, how did you enter the humanitarian space? Over to you.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So I started a little bit differently traditionally than most physicians. I was a paramedic in New York City, and I worked in the New York City EMS system for about 10 years. And during that time, I got involved in humanitarian response as a paramedic, and specifically with an organization called NYC Medics, which didn't exist at the time because a group of paramedics at my ambulance station in Hell's Kitchen founded it back in 2005. And we had an opportunity to respond to the earthquake in northern Pakistan in 2005. And it was something I didn't really know much about, the humanitarian sector. And to be honest, I hadn't really thought about it. I just had never been exposed to it. And I was offered this opportunity to travel with a group of other paramedics and physicians to Pakistan. And I said yes. Without much thought about it, and I went. And then next thing I know, I was there and participating in this response, and it was an incredible experience. And I know it sounds cliche, but it was one of those very eye-opening experiences for me where I realized that there was a world outside of New York. Which I'm sorry to the New Yorkers here, but I did realize that there is a world outside, although New York is still my home, and that there's so much work to be done. There's so much need out there. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of needs in New York and here in Boston, but there's needs everywhere. And I realized the impact that I could have by doing this work was huge, and I was just fascinated by it. So I returned, and that's when I decided to return to school and started the long process that many of you are familiar with of going to pre-med classes and MCATs in medical school. And I always knew this is what I wanted to do. And then throughout emergency medicine and now to today, have landed in this position where I can do this work and do it at scale, which is great.
Sean, if you can give us an example of like the humanitarian responses that you've been involved with in the last few years. We're eager to kind of hear some of the color of the deployment, and for you to also explain kind of what are the additional skills you needed beyond being a certified emergency medicine physician to be able to be operational and successful in the field.
Yeah, I'll take the second part of that first, because I think this is really important. The first thing to know about humanitarian response is that it requires people of all talents and professional backgrounds. So as a physician, my insertion point is in healthcare, but that's just a very, very small piece of the larger pie of what's needed in humanitarian response. The healthcare sector cannot be effective without support from shelter, from water, sanitation, hygiene, from logistics, from education, from security, for food security and planning, so on and so forth. So it really takes everyone, and that was important for me to acknowledge. I entered the field as a healthcare responder, but quickly realizing that to have an effective humanitarian response, you need to work collaboratively with everybody else. That's a lot of what we do at HHI, is reaching out to all of these other professional backgrounds and building these bridges to have a good response. And that's a lot of what H1 does. And I think that's why this is a good collaboration of bringing together people with different backgrounds. And as for responses I've been involved with, the first for me was that response to Pakistan. And then I was able to do several others, including Haiti, which you mentioned earlier, which in 2010, which was a really important learning experience for me as I looked through the humanitarian response in a different lens and realized some of the challenges. And that throughout the course of several responses since then has led to our current work at HHI, working to really professionalize the humanitarian sector and provide education and training to responders and future leaders in the humanitarian space, which we'll talk a little bit about some of the curriculum and education opportunities a little bit later.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. I know a lot of folks online are thinking through, gosh, okay, I already trained clinically, but in the setting where I was a resident, for example, I have like clinical mentors, but the variability of care and the agility, Sean, we're eager to kind of learn how you picked up those skills over time. Another aspect of this is you've actually deployed with different NGOs, and you watch different NGOs build EMT teams and think about how they'll deploy in the space. And what have you learned as a professional, kind of functionally joining as a clinician to different NGOs, maybe with different operating models and different requests from you over time?
Yeah, so there's so many NGOs out there, thousands. We don't even know, to be honest, how many. There's a core group of larger ones that are for healthcare involved in the health cluster at WHO and the EMT teams at WHO, but there's so many more. And importantly, I want to highlight that the vast majority of NGOs in the world are local NGOs on the national level that often get neglected. And part of our work here is to try to bridge that gap and help connect local physicians in different countries of the world with NGOs serving that area, instead of it being just international cross-border response. So I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of NGOs in different capacities, both in response and advising, and also in our educational programs at HHI. And as you saw from the example I showed, we have a partnership with the International Medical Corps working in Ukraine and also other areas. But there's a long list. We've done large projects with CARE and working, of course, in the Harvard system with Partners in Health, who's been a great source of experience and mentors for me especially when I was first starting out. And Team Rubicon, who is already partnering with the H1 to help staff their response network, and a lot of UN agencies like OCHA and the World Health Organization. So what I've learned, I think, is the more important part, and that's that there is a gap in connection between the organizations that are providing response and the people who want to be part of that response. And what I've seen is you have I think of three buckets of people. You have career full-time humanitarian or global health workers. And this is, for example, a person who works full-time for an NGO or UN agency. And this is their commitment. This is what they do. This is their full-time job. That's a smaller subset of people that cannot meet all the needs that exist in the world. They're critically important because they're the foundation, but they can't do it all themselves. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's a large cohort of physicians and other professionals who are interested in humanitarian response and may not know how to get involved or how to get involved properly, or may get involved in different local organizations. And then in the middle, there's a group of, I think, of semi-experienced people who have proper training. And that's what HHI provides, which is opportunities to become trained in professional and humanitarian response and participate in response on a professional level. So the problem is these three groups don't always talk to each other, and you have a response where it can't be staffed, or it's not staffed with high quality people, or you have people who are really eager and motivated to get involved, but they don't have the proper mentorship or training to get involved or to understand the diversity of organizations to make the right choices. So what we've been doing over the years is trying to bridge this gap at HHI through our networks. And what H1 is doing now is really putting their machinery and their breadth of scope behind this to make this a reality, something that we've been trying to do for a long time.
Thank you. I'm going to walk us through kind of your involvement with H1 Connect, but I want to also take a step back that, Sean, it's so valuable to have your insights at this altitude, because this work is actually decades. And it's less about, unfortunately, responding to one emergency in the moment, but what are the resources, the capacity, the preparedness that's needed so the next generation of clinicians and others are ready to respond. And I know that's a huge part of your education portfolio and capacity building. And what you can do, for example, with your Harvard Humanitarian hat on, what should be done outside of academia. So I'm curious, you to kind of take a step back for a second, what gap do you think H1 Connect is filling that, for example, you functionally couldn't do, even though you've been working on this topic for decades with your HHI hat on?
Yeah, so the first thing, the humanitarian response is changing, and people talk about that a lot, and it needs to change. And the thing I think some people don't realize is that it's always changing, and it's always been changing. Humanitarian response and the concept has been around since antiquity. You can see examples in as far back in history as you want to go. And then we think of modern humanitarian response, which is really the ICRC era in the late 1800s that began, and then onwards through the post-World War II UN era that we're in now. And it continues to change, and focusing and addressing some of the real problems with humanitarian response, which largely is lack of localization and lack of honest dialogue between international and local partners, and looking at how resources are allocated and used and things like that. What we do at Harvard, and one of the reasons that I'm here, is we have this educational program that we're very lucky to have, trying to train the next generation of humanitarian professionals. We do this at the School of Public Health, where we have a course that walks students through all the different aspects of humanitarian response, the history, the challenges, and we brainstorm about how can we make this better, recognizing that the only constant in humanitarian response is change, and the need for change, and how we can improve it. And same at HHI with our educational programs, where we honestly, over the years, we've worked with, I would say, probably every NGO and UN organization on some degree, if at a minimum, at least training somebody from their staff over the years. And we've trained literally thousands of students through our in-person programs and our online programs in partnership with USAID and other organizations like IMC and Concern. We've trained tens of thousands, if not more, of students around the world. Despite that, the gap remains that we struggle to access people outside of our networks. The people in my network tend to be healthcare professionals, because that's the background I come from, whether ER doctors or other physicians or pre-hospital providers or nurses. But that's not enough, because my network also tends to be from North America or Europe. And what we need are humanitarian responders who are from the regions affected by humanitarian emergencies. And we need to connect with them. And to be honest, I don't know them, because I live in Boston. So what H1 provides is this reach this reach to people outside of not just my networks, but my networks that can get in touch with people and show people around the world opportunities to get involved in responses close to home or in their region. And not just that, not because anybody could do that with a web search, but helping provide advice and mentorship and education so that humanitarian response can be done professionally. And that's my hope, because the biggest change that we see is the need for localization. And this is a great opportunity, I think, to strengthen that.
I absolutely agree. That was spot on, Sean. I mean, think of all the talent that's on this line today and the years of clinical training that people put into to prepare themselves to have this be part of their professional path. This bridge building that H1 Connect's doing is helping that profile be so central. That enables, it may be an educational opportunity, a scholarship, a deployment, but the stronger those profiles, it actually helps all of us at H1 Connect find the right opportunities to fit the next stage of folks' career as they kind of expand their portfolio, maybe beyond the clinical opportunities where they are. So on the line, we probably have dozens, maybe 20, 30 countries represented, because our H1 Connect members are from hundreds of countries. What would you say to those folks who are kind of waiting to find a deployment? They've trained in their country, they've finished their clinical training, they've posted their H1 profile. What other advice would you have for them? And I know folks will ask specific questions in the Q&A.
A few things. The first is patience. And this is something that I tell everybody I work with in this space, and something I've had to learn is, by nature, this space, humanitarian response, can be a little chaotic. Things move fast, things change quickly, projects shift for a variety of reasons, often out of any one organization or person's control. And you have to be flexible, and you have to accept that this is what you're signing up for, is to work in an environment where you are literally responding to emergencies, and by definition, they change quickly. So you have to be able to absorb that and go with that, which can take some adjustment compared to a normal job where the job is there and you show up and work. So patience and flexibility are probably the most two important things. But also, it's not just about waiting for the opportunity, it's about preparing yourself and setting yourself up so that when that opportunity happens, you are as prepared as possible. So ways to get involved, I think, are, we're providing this roster, which is meant to be a connection to different NGOs and organizations, but to prepare yourself by taking humanitarian training courses. There's many out there. So of course we have them at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, but that's not the only place to find them. And I encourage you to become educated. As Rebecca mentioned, you may say, to use a physician example, well, I went to college, medical school, I did residency, and now maybe a fellowship, maybe some other research training. But the thing is that none of that really prepares you for humanitarian response. And you need to get specific training in humanitarian response so you understand how the sector works and how you can be professional in it. So that's the biggest thing, is to prepare yourself and be ready. But the important thing, and what we're really trying to do here, is break down the barrier to entry. So it can feel, when you're on the outside looking in, it can feel like a very closed group, the humanitarian sector. And some of that is historical, and some of that is just by default of the network that exists, and people work with people they know and worked with before. And one thing we're trying to do here is to break down that barrier and connect people who are traditionally outside of that network of core humanitarian responders with everybody else in the world, all the physicians, nurses, pre-hospital providers, and other professionals that have something real and meaningful, and I think very important, to contribute to humanitarian response, particularly in their own home countries or regions.
Thank you, Sean. So let's just say we could, the 5-minute version of how you end your course. Like, what are your takeaways? Let's say the 50 of us could sign up for your course and be in your next cohort. Just give folks a sense of, this is what you'd be learning if you took this course. It's almost abstract, right? How could you learn something in a course to gain the skills of agility, of learning how to respond, observation, etc.? I think that would help folks get a sense, and I hope in many ways get folks to enroll in the courses that you provide and others to gain these skills.
Sure. I use the example of our Humanitarian Response Intensive course, which is a professional course we run every spring here in Boston. And you can find more detailed information on our website at HHI. But to The concept of the course is bringing together early and mid-career humanitarian professionals, and some of which have a little bit of experience, and some that have maybe no experience but a really strong interest in this space. And we cover everything. It's not a healthcare course by design. It's a course to cover humanitarian response, and there's three general phases of the course. The first phase is foundations, which is really important for anybody to understand. That includes the history of humanitarian response, and there's different histories. And some of those histories are controversial, but people still need to understand where we've come from as a sector, so we can avoid making mistakes that have been made in the past and build on the work that's been done before. And then spending time on cross-cutting foundational issues like international humanitarian law and human rights law, and understanding how that affects humanitarian work. How does refugee law affect humanitarian work? These are really critical concepts that any humanitarian responder must understand so they can function properly and ethically and morally in the humanitarian space. And then a little bit about the alphabet soup. As you've already heard, as we rattle off organizations and NGOs, there's an unending alphabet soup of acronyms and organizations in the humanitarian space. So a little bit understanding, how does this all connect? What are the different pillars of humanitarian response? You have UN organizations, you have governments, you have international NGOs, you have local NGOs, you have funders. And most importantly, you have the affected communities that are going through a humanitarian crisis. And how do you put them at the center of it and change the way we look at humanitarian response? Instead of a central approach around these organizations, how do we center it on the people who are affected and work closely with them? And that's one of the big changes we try to push. That's phase one. Then we move through the technical sectors that go through. Some of you hopefully are familiar with the Sphere Handbook, which is a really great manual that's been developed by many different NGOs working together to create minimum standards in humanitarian response. This is something that was really critically needed. And we go through that, and particularly the core sectors: shelter, food, water, sanitation, hygiene, and finally health. As you can already see, I've listed off, I think, 8 topics now, and we're only just now getting to health, just to show how small. It's a critical part, don't get me wrong, it's a critical part of humanitarian response, but it's one of many critical parts. And after we go through that second phase of the class, talking about these core sectors, then the third and final phase is what I think of as everything else. And this is the more unique topics, which I think are the most interesting. Things like logistics, education, and not education like us teaching, but how do you restart primary education for children in displaced populations? And how do you prevent the long-term outcomes of generation gaps of education? Things that we don't always think about, that we need to get schools up and running as quickly as possible. And then how do you support that? Things like security for the affected populations. How do you prevent things like people taking advantage of a displaced of a population on a move, like human trafficking and other things like that, exploitation? But also, how do you keep your organization safe, and how do you keep yourselves safe so you have plans and security plans? Because anybody who's doing this work needs to ensure that they're not becoming part of the problem. You need to be self-sufficient and have your own proper security plans and planning. And how do you build that? And going through controversies, we try to take the controversies head on. There are really uncomfortable and striking parallels between the colonial history of North America and Europe in the world and humanitarian response. And if you look through the recent history of humanitarian response and how it was built and structured, it's almost the same story as colonialism. And in fact, there's really strong connections of why it was created to support colonial endeavors back in the past. And it's beyond time that we, as people working in the sector, face this head on and have these difficult conversations. And we encourage that in our class so we can try to foster change. So that's really, that's a lot, but that's a summary, and there's much more. But I think the takeaway is to understand you need to get the foundation of the response of how you can be within the laws and the legal structure and the ethical. You need to understand the technical core sectors and how can you have this technical expertise in a broad sense. And then you need to understand everything else and how you can advance the future of humanitarian response and do so safely and responsibly.
Okay, Sean, well, I'm ready to sign up, and I think there's probably many other.
Anytime.
This is comprehensive. I mean, I think, and just curious for you to give folks a sense of when people you're mentoring and your own clinical schedule, how do you think about your own clinical deployment, the number of deployments you can functionally do over time? So 20 years into your clinical career, 30 years into your clinical career. Curious how you even think about that planning for yourself and those that you mentor.
Yeah, it all depends on what your professional background is. So again, like me as an ER physician, going back to the very first question you asked, Rebecca, one of the reasons I picked emergency medicine as a specialty is because I knew it would give me a broad-based skill set that would allow me to really insert into different environments. And there's a certain flexibility working in the emergency department that's demanded, and that I knew would allow me to plug in and adapt. Also importantly is the scheduling, and this is a real thing to think about for everybody engaging in this work, is what are your other obligations? What are your core job, your main job that takes care of you financially, that you hopefully one day will retire from and provides you your healthcare benefits depending on what country you're in. And so how does that fit into your ability to respond? Is your employer going to be okay with you coming and going? And how can you balance that? So it's a really critical piece. So I think for me, I'm very lucky that I work at an academic institution at Brigham and Women's Hospital and within the larger system here that really supports this type of work. And I couldn't do it alone. There's a large group of ER doctors in my group that really support this work. And not everybody does this work, but everybody supports it. And what that means is when I or somebody else in my group needs to travel, people move around and come together to fill those shifts because somebody needs to be in the ER here in Boston working. So how can we work as a group? So that you need to build your village and build your support network wherever you are. And you need to have buy-in from your employer and buy-in from your colleagues, probably even more importantly, because they're the ones who are going to have to support you and support the institution while you're traveling. So you need to be able to make the case. Some organizations are known for really being supportive of this, and some are less so. Not necessarily because they're not supportive, it just doesn't fit into their model. So I encourage people to really look closely at that. And there's other models of doing part-time work and part-time humanitarian response. There's different ways to cut it, but I think it's our responsibility to make sure we do this responsibly, not just for the humanitarian sector and the populations affected, but for our people at home, wherever home is, that you're not becoming a challenging or a problem employee for your colleagues or anybody else.
Sean, that is such a helpful answer because it gives folks a sense of, gosh, what do I need to prepare for now so that I can deploy in the future? As I sign up for the Ready Reserve, I build my profile. What are the conversations I need to have with my colleagues? How do I maybe even prepare and do more clinical time at certain times of the year in preparation for this type of opportunity? I want to connect back to your comments about localization, which I just thought were so striking. And the term, that so many of us are working to advance global health equity. And I think this is actually the North Star of H1 Connect and why I also signed on, because I thought how tremendous this asset that H1 already had of having the profile of most physicians on the globe. What does that actually functionally look like? How do we operationalize global health equity? H1 Connect's one example, but I'm sure you've seen others throughout your career.
Yeah, well, the reality is that all initial first response is local, right? And that goes from when we train healthcare providers. The real first responder is not a paramedic or a physician. The real first responder is usually an untrained civilian bystander who witnesses the event and tries to help. So we need to, in an emergency care system building, we directly target that untrained civilian bystander so that when something happens, they can be empowered to help and to feel like they can support the system. It's the same concept in humanitarian response. All initial humanitarian responders to any crisis are local. They're the local population who was or is continuing to be directly affected by whatever that humanitarian crisis is. What that response looks like will be different. But so our goal is, yes, to train professionals who are going to travel in, whether it's inside the same country or from a different country. But that takes time. The initial response, that first 24, 48 hours, is almost exclusively by the local population. So our goal is to train that population, to access them, and to provide them with even the core minimum training of how do you keep yourself safe? How do you keep your family safe? How do you start preparing the response? And how do you, importantly, when all these other big players come in, whether it's the government or the UN, how do you liaise with them so that your voice doesn't get lost in the crowd and that you don't get stomped out? And as as you mentioned, it's the what H1 offers, and why I'm interested in this too, is that access to people around the world who exist everywhere and are exposed to humanitarian responses. And how can we connect with them? How can we train them? And how can we empower them to provide a good humanitarian response in those first hours? And then hopefully lead the humanitarian response and not be crowded out by these international players, but actually take on leadership positions where they work to improve the situation for their communities. It shouldn't be somebody from Boston traveling to another part of the world to try to teach people how to do things better or do things better. That's not the case. I can never do it better. The people who can do it better are the people who live there, who are from there, who have longstanding commitments to that community. And that's our goal here, is to really find those voices, help partner with them so that they can take on these leadership positions.
Sean, this is such a striking example of working upstream to prepare for global health equity. Your work in building capacity, in direct education, in thinking through the processes of deployment and the partnerships. And I think you spoke about not only localization, but changing some of the power imbalances that were unfortunately continued for many decades in early humanitarian response. And we think of the breadth and depth of who you're interfacing with, and the many of your fans were online, and then now engaging with H1 Connect. These become in many ways beneficial and mutually beneficial partnerships. We're learning from all of you who are online what you need, what you're looking forward to do, what types of deployments you're interested in to be of service. So eager to, Sean, first, thank you so much for this time. And I think we're all very inspired. I'm going to turn over to Miles and Katie, because I know there's questions in the chat and other topics to talk to today. Over to you.
Yeah, so I believe we have one question in the chat. It's a little longer, so I'm just going to read it out because this person said it better than I could. I feel like connecting a diverse workforce to humanitarian needs have been a problem for some time. Can you speak about resilience in the sector and how groups like HHI and or H1 address the global workforce well-being?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. And I see you mentioned Shahidi and Relief Web earlier in your question too, which are two great organizations and knowledge repositories. In particular, I highlight Relief Web, which for a long time has been what we call, and I feel like these days, as I was talking to students recently, I realized that I'm dating myself because nobody in the class knew what a classified ad was, but it's the classifieds of emergency of humanitarian response and where jobs are posted. The problem is, there's still a lot of barriers to that. People need to apply, they need to be aware of the positions, and there's a lot of challenges. You're absolutely right that diversity of workforce and humanitarian response is a huge problem. Even when you talk to humanitarian organizations, they have country offices, but those country offices are almost exclusively or very frequently led by somebody not from that country. And the people who control the finances or the budgets or HR are not from that country. So what we hope to do here with HHI and with H1 is to break down that barrier and that wall a little bit by giving a direct connection. Instead of having intermediaries through Relief Web or through Shahidi or through NGOs or organizations, we hope to directly connect all of you, everybody out there, and so many more people directly with the organizations doing the response, and put it in front of the organizations, so that the organizations that say they want to engage in localization and they're committed to this, well, we can say, well, we have these several hundred vetted people right here in your region, drivable distance to where you are, who want to help. And I think that by putting that in front of the leaders and the community over and over again, and making the people who I think sometimes feel invisible and making them as visible as possible to these organizations, that's how we influence change. It doesn't happen overnight, but it happens with persistence and by showing that there are extremely qualified, I think more qualified people all around the world who are better suited to providing these humanitarian responses than international actors. International actors such as myself, I think, are still important, but as one of my mentors always said, and I feel very strongly about, our number one goal in this sector is to put ourselves out of a job, so that these responses are all able, that capabilities locally are built.
Great. Thank you, Sean. We just got another great question in the chat. How do you determine, and you could be an we're speaking on behalf of NGOs here or an organization like the World Health Organization, but how do you determine when an event requires a global humanitarian response? Who makes that decision? And can you talk about a time or an example when there was not like an agreement on whether a response was needed?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, so come take my class, but because that we talk specifically about that a lot, because that's a great example of the really important logistical underpinnings of humanitarian response that people need to understand. Like, what is the machinery behind this? Because there is a machinery, and who makes these decisions? So I start my class every year with on the very first night, and I ask everybody to take out a blank sheet of paper, and I ask them to write down in one sentence, what is humanitarianism? And to write it down like you're going to describe it to your grandmother who does not know anything about humanitarian response. And it's in one sentence, and I make everybody take a minute, think about it, and define humanitarianism in one sentence, fold up the paper, and then at the end of the class, we read them. And I think it's educational for everybody, because when you actually try, and I encourage you to try to do it today, but it's actually hard to do. It's a big concept, and what does it really mean? And then the second question is, what is a humanitarian crisis? So there's all kinds of crises in the world and disasters, but what's the difference? So the difference is there's several definitions, but the main, I think, general definition is a humanitarian emergency exists when local capacity is completely exceeded to the point where it is breaking down. So where the disaster is so large that the local agencies cannot manage it, and sometimes maybe the local agencies are so directly affected by the disaster as well that they cannot coordinate an effective response. And the only way to provide a response and to provide the emergent response is from outside help. Whether that outside help happens from within the same country, look at the US models of like FEMA and DMAT teams, or if it happens externally. And that's where OCHA comes in. So the part two of this question is, who makes the decision? So who sits down, and you can picture this, people sitting around a table deciding, is this a crisis or not? Well, now it's usually sitting around a Zoom screen that they do it, but that is basically what happens. And it's so there's the main organization is the IASC, which is the Interagency Standing Committee, and then also with the UN side is OCHA, the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And there's several other inputs and players into this, and the Emergency Relief Coordinator at the UN, and they come together as a group, usually with representatives from the affected area country offices, and decide, does this meet criteria for a response? And there's different response levels that can be reached. So there is a process for this, and you can actually start to read about it yourself. If you go to UN OCHA's website or IASC, Interagency Standing Committee's websites, that's where you can learn a little bit about this process and how these decisions are made. But again, it speaks to the need for education and preparedness for the responders themselves, because these are the things to be an effective responder. And if you're going to liaise as a local actor with these international actors, you need to understand this stuff.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful, and I'll go read on those websites as well. We are getting a lot of questions about trainings. I know you mentioned, the things you can do prior to deployment to prepare yourself. I'll provide the H1 answer for those who didn't see it. So we post the trainings that Sean, Rebecca, the NGOs we work with recommend on our site. So to access those, create an H1 profile, log in, and you'll find those training and resources. We're always adding to that list, and we post them on our regular communication channels as well. But one of the questions we're getting are, what are some specific trainings and additional attributes, background that you look for in a new volunteer or someone deploying into one of these emergency responses?
Yeah, so for me, the number one thing I look for has technical expertise is important. I don't want to minimize it, but for me, there's a lot of people with strong technical expertise. What makes somebody stand out to me is their passion, their motivation, their flexibility, and their ability to commit to actually do the work and do it responsibly, do it in a timely manner. And probably most importantly, the ability to work on a team effectively. Because as you've heard, humanitarian response is a team sport. No one person can do this alone. No one profession can do this alone. No one organization can do this alone. That's why these groups like OCHA and ISC have formed, because even no one NGO or no one UN agency can do it alone. Everybody needs to work together, and it can be difficult. That's the reality. People have competing priorities. There's different challenges that they need to focus on. So probably the single most important thing is the ability to work in a team, and then to do that under very stressful conditions, because it's hard enough, as we all know, we all work in teams in our jobs, whatever they may be, and it has its ups and downs. But now imagine doing that in a humanitarian crisis, and it makes it, any small cracks can become big fissures. So you need to be able to work on a team. That's probably the most important thing. I can train people about, and it's the same in the ER, to be honest. I tell medical students or residents, so I can train somebody the technical expertise, whether it's how to provide healthcare in a humanitarian setting or how to provide emergency care in an ER. What is harder to train is that personality and work ethic and ability to work in a team and ability to be teachable. So those are the most important things.
Thank you. Another question we're getting, and this is something that I'm not familiar with, so hoping you are. Can you talk about the International Emergency Medicine Fellowship?
Sure. I mean, it's related, but I don't want to go too far into it. So this is throughout the United States there and Canada. There's about 36 academic hospitals that run what are called global or international emergency medicine fellowships. What this is an opportunity specifically for a physician, and there are variations of this for different types of specialties. There's I'll talk about some of them, but for emergency medicine specifically, there's these 36 programs. And the idea is if you're an ER doctor and you've done residency and you say, I really want to get involved in humanitarian response, global health, it's an opportunity to do extra training and to really drill down for a year or two and focus in on this to build a career. There's similar programs for surgeons, for internists, for OBGYNs, really for every pediatricians. So whatever your specialty is, I encourage you to look at a good place to start, at least in the US, is to start at your national organization level and ask around. And internationally, there's organizations too. For emergency medicine, there's IFEM and there's others. So yeah, so it's a way to get extra training specifically for physicians, but there are actually a growing number of nursing programs for this as well, which I think are starting to grow finally.
Great, thank you for that answer. I'm just looking through the chat. We just got a couple questions in before the time comes up. So here is one. Can you talk a little bit more about how you engage local agencies and organizations in preparing for emergency response in settings where resources are limited? And what is the infrastructure they need to build to be ready? And does it detract from current priorities? So a few questions in there.
Yeah. No, I'll move this quick because I know we're running short on time. But I would say that the way, I'll give you an example. So when we work anywhere in the world, the first thing we recognize is that at the end of the day, we know nothing. We're guests and visitors, and we know literally nothing. And our job is to learn. So what we do is you show up, and whether it's at a hospital or a government office or something else, and you ask questions and you say, and you pose a scenario. So you pose a scenario. If there was an earthquake here tomorrow, who would respond? And you'll get answers. Or if there was a big car accident here tomorrow, where would those patients go and who would treat them? Because even if there's not a well-designed system as we would recognize, and by we, I mean in the Western centric humanitarian response or global health world, then there is an answer and there's a system. And our job is to understand that system and see how we can strengthen it and work within local resources, and then find ways to connect with international resources, whether it's funding or a logistical organization like the UN, to try to strengthen that system. So it's all about understanding what is there and how we can connect it with best practice guidance in a reasonable, context appropriate way.
Great. I think we have time for one more. And I think I'll pick out something that's thematic. So we're seeing a lot of questions about like the logistics surrounding a deployment. So like how long ahead of time will I know? How long will I be there? And you know, as you've mentioned during this session, like these consistencies really don't exist in the emergency response sector. But can you perhaps just briefly describe like one of your deployments that you would deem
Sure.
typical?
Yeah, so it varies widely. And it depends. The more acute the emergency, the shorter notice. So it could be as short as an earthquake or a flood or a conflict. Something happens very acutely with no notice. And it could be as early as you're hearing about this happening in the morning, and by that afternoon, you're getting on a plane and going. And that's what we have our teams ready to do, and being part of the initial response. And that's not so much responding as much as it's assessing and going and understanding what is the situation, so that then fuller response teams can come in. So it could be that quick. And those deployments tend to be shorter in nature because of the abruptness, 2-3 weeks maybe at most. And because they're very disruptive, right, to personal lives, to employment, and everything else. But then as the crisis evolves, and then you may have a few weeks warning. I'll use our Ukraine project, for example. We've deployed over 250 people in and out of Ukraine over the past 2 years. And the typical lead time that we give people is, we try to give them as much as possible, which could be up to 2 months, 3 months, maybe lead time. It's almost never more than that, because we don't know what's happening on the ground, and the situation is changing so quickly. And again, and I can speak from experience from our Ukraine project that we're doing, things change. People can be committed, everything's lined up. We've had situations where the plane tickets are booked, everything is ready, and we have to make a change, whether it's security related or other needs related, and that goes to the flexibility. I always tell people in this space that nothing is happening or committed until you're literally on the airplane and it has taken off. Up until that point, be prepared to, turn around and go back home. And that's not a failure. That just means the needs have shifted, and respond and adapting to that is part of being a professional. So I'd say it varies quickly to hours, to weeks. The probably most typical response is a few weeks notification, which is tough. And that's why you need that village around you, whether it's your home life, your personal life, your professional life, to support you and make it happen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sean. I know we're at time. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat unanswered, unless Miles, you're seeing anything on your end.
Yeah, just one thing I do want to highlight. We've had this question from Dr. Rashid for a while here. So, and Sean, feel free to jump in, but a lot of times people ask us like, hey, why aren't there more opportunities? Like there's so much conflict and issues around the world, like H1, why can't you deploy me to more places and all that? And this question here is, could H1 Connect look into finding this component and deploy their own humanitarian missions? And, I do want to just clarify for the group here that don't think of H1 Connect as an NGO ourselves. Like, we are not going out and deploying doctors, nurses, anybody on our own. Everything we do is in concert with our partner NGO organizations. And then everything our NGO partners do is in concert with the World Health Organization or other global groups, with the intent being that we're doing this as a unified group that has a common, ways of care, and we're not going off and running our own missions kind of in a silo. The whole point of what we're trying to do here is build this network through the World Health Organization's EMT program to have that standard of care as we're going and doing these medical missions. So we're looking for as many opportunities as possible, but just want people to know that, that it takes time, as Sean and Rebecca had mentioned here.
Miles, I do want to jump in, after October 7th, I reached out to the World Health Organization's office, and they were very clear, this has not been developed a ready reserve. And so you can imagine, for each NGO, they're managing just the logistics, not just the intense logistics of getting capacity in country. So the work that it takes to do this preparation, to have people set up profiles, the more profiles we actually have, right, the more deployments we can actually then attract and redistribute. And, you know, it was very compelling when the World Health Organization said, this has not been done, and we need this to be done in some economies of scale, which has taken a lot of partnership work by Katie and Miles and other members of the H1 team. So that's when I go back to like, what is global health equity? Well, some of that's actually the day-to-day processes, how you develop partnerships, how do you prepare in advance? And then it enables a place like the World Health Organization to gain, in a sense, more confidence. We will have a larger roster. Over time, this should be absolutely and representative of the whole health workforce and others. I know there's a mention here about nurses, and Sean's mentioned this before. We need a very large group of professionals ready, reserved, and profiled and ready for the next deployments. So I'm just so grateful for everyone online. There's so much clinical and operational expertise. I wish we could go around robin to all 50 people for them to share their expertise. But the idea here really in these hours is that we share different folks' expertise. So also if there's anyone online who's interested in participating and has other questions and other insights that they'd like to share in these types of hours, please send a chat to Miles or Katie or myself as well.
Yeah, or email us. I'm going to put our email in here. We're always looking for new ideas and new people to help volunteer and help us build this network. So I'll put the email in the chat here.
Thank you, Miles. And while you drop that, a couple of reminders to wrap us up. So to what Rebecca just said, the first step to getting involved is to signing up for H1 Connect. So Miles has posted that link in the chat, and then making sure that the information in your profile, medical licensure, experience, all of that jazz is up to date. So we have that information. And then make sure that you join the WhatsApp community if that's a platform you like using. We've dropped that link in the chat as well. And then by joining that network, you'll receive emails, WhatsApps, carrier pigeons, just kidding, etc. About, you know, all of these upcoming webinars, other opportunities and resources posted. Sean, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining. I found this conversation so valuable, and I'm sure the people in our network did as well. And then to all of you who have joined, thank you so much for making the time today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good one, guys. Bye.